You know, if St. Patrick's Day is going to fall on Sunday, well, it just seems appropriate to recognize this historical figure of our faith. I don't think that St. Patrick ever really drank green beer, but I'm sure he saw his share of shamrocks. And he was actually a Brit who spent most of his life in Ireland. Patrick was born into a wealthy Christian family in England in about the 5th century, when England was a part of the Roman Empire, but Ireland was still isolated and somewhat tribal. And Patrick described himself as a bit of a rebel as a teenager, one of those alienated, ungoverned youth like many 16-year-olds today. But his life changed when he was 16. At the time, the Irish were famous for taking slaves. They would come in raids, and they captured and carted off people from other countries to serve their chieftains and their warlords on their island. And Patrick was captured during one of those raids when he was 16, taken against his will far from his home. And once in Ireland, he was sold to a tribal chieftain who put him to work herding cattle in the hills. He spent a lot of time there alone with his thoughts, and he began to pray to that God that he had previously ignored. And he wrote, "I used to stay out in the forests and on the mountains, and I would wake up before daylight and pray in the snow and the icy cold and the rain. And I would feel neither ill nor slothfulness, because as I look back now, I see that the Spirit was burning in me at the time." At the same time, while he was there, he began to identify with the very people who had captured him and enslaved him. And he learned their language and their culture, and he began to understand their worldview and their religion. At the time, he came to love them. And in a very real sense, Patrick, who had grown up with the privilege of the Roman Empire, came to identify with these outsiders and see them as human, not as the barbarians that most of the Romans considered them to be. But he was a slave, and he sought his freedom, and he says that after 6 years there in captivity, he had a vision one night in a dream that said, "You're going home and your ship is ready." And he got up the next morning and he walked 200 miles towards the coast, and he found a boat that was headed to France, and he was able to get on it and make his way back home to England. But it wasn't long before he believed he was being called back to Ireland. And so he began to study to become a priest. Now, the Roman Church wanted new converts to be Romanized culturally. Once a population became Christian, they were expected to read and speak Latin and to take on the Roman customs and do things the way the Romans did. But Patrick had a love and respect for the Irish culture. And he did things differently. He went to the villages and he prayed for the people who were sick and counseled those in need and mediated their conflicts. He blessed a river and prayed for the people as they sought to catch fish. He made the sacred mundane and the ordinary sacred. He found God and revealed God in the everyday elements of life. And he used stories and parables and engaged that Irish connection to nature. So St. Patrick opened the door to the Celtic understanding of Christianity that we need so much now. A worldview that respects nature, that values and places the contributions of the animals and the birds and the trees and the beauty of the earth and the depths of the sea. And he used stories rooted in nature to teach about the God of love with the same wisdom and empathy that Jesus had revealed centuries before. Now, all cultures throughout human history have used animals to describe people and the ways that we relate to one another. The anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss observed that humankind had learned early on that animals weren't, well, just good to eat, but also good to think with. The prophets used animals to describe God. The image of Israel finding shelter under God's wings occurs frequently in the Old Testament. Psalm 57 says, "In the shadow of your wings I will take refuge." And Boaz says to Ruth, "May you have the full reward of the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." Now, in the story from Luke that we read today, Jesus reminds us of this image of that God as a mother hen, but he also chooses another animal, one to describe the king. Herod was looking for Jesus to have him arrested and killed, and Jesus tells his spies, "You tell that fox I will keep healing and freeing people from the demonic forces that oppress them." Now, foxes have been traditionally thought of as being cunning and tricky and greedy. Aesop's fables have almost 30 stories with foxes in them. Sometimes in those stories they get what they want, and sometimes they are caught up by their pride. But when Jesus calls Herod a fox, it's not just a reference to being clever or sneaky. It was an insult. For Herod was the king of Judea, and the symbol of the nation was a lion. Like many other countries and cultures, the lion was considered the king of the beasts and therefore was a kingly symbol. And the fox is not a lion. As Shane Claiborne explains, the fox was often mistaken for a lion, but it wasn't a king of anything. The fox was an imposter, a wannabe lion. Foxes sneak around and they steal and they cower in the face of something larger and stronger. Lindsay Paris Lopez describes the situation there this way. Herod brutally kept the peace by squashing dissent, but he himself was a puppet of the oppressive Roman Empire. And this was the strategy of Rome. You allow the rulers to have wealth as long as they crush any opposition, as long as they ensure the class divisions and squelch any uprising. So Herod was a pawn of the sacrificial system of Rome, who had no real power. So Jesus is calling Herod an illegitimate coward. For this word fox recognizes not only Herod's cruelty, but his fear and his vulnerability to those who could destroy him. And it's kind of interesting that one of Aesop's fables is a perfect example of this vision of the fox. There was a lion and a donkey and a fox who formed a partnership, and they went out hunting. And when they had taken in a quantity of game, the lion told the donkey to share it out. So the donkey divided their gains into 3 equal parts and told the lion to choose one. And suddenly the lion leapt on him in a fury and devoured the donkey. And next the lion told the fox to divide up what they had gained. And the fox collected nearly all of it into one pile and just a few pieces for himself, and he told the lion to make his choice. And the lion asked him, "Well, who taught you to share things that way?" So what happened to the donkey was the fox's answer. The fox was clever but lived in fear. The fox acts bold but is vulnerable. It is that same fear that is the lifeblood of oppression that keeps most people from speaking out against it. But those who name it for what it is, they introduce a healing balm of courage into communities that are poisoned by fear. Speaking truth to and about power was a part of Jesus' mission. Fox, a word of contempt, but it might have also been a word of pity. Jesus is essentially saying not just go tell that coward and that poser. He's saying go tell that poor, paranoid man who is so enslaved in his fears that he lets the humanity leach out of his soul. Tell him I'm not afraid of him, and I'm going to keep healing a little while longer. Jesus is healing and casting out the demons of fear and self-loathing. He's casting out the voices that tell us that we are nothing, those voices that keep us under the power of paranoia and violence. This work of healing is the work of creating a world that is based on mercy, creating a world that is building networks of human love that can spread and shine love and hope and compassion. And this healing includes finding the foxes in all of us, the parts of us that lash out in cruelty out of fear. The healing is in soothing and transforming us as well. Paris Lopez sheds light on the meaning of these animal images of foxes and mother hens. As Jesus says to the people of Jerusalem, "How long have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, but you were not willing." Would we be willing? Would we be willing to gather under the wings of a mother hen in the face of a fox? What kind of protection can a hen offer? Don't we really all want the lion who can chase away the fox or anyone else? But Jesus is changing the story, for he overcomes the violence by allowing himself to be its victim. For the hen is the fox's prey and the lion's prey, and he will become the victim of all human violence, and he will rise again, and he will bring forgiveness. By becoming the victim of our worship of violence, by responding with mercy that outshines our hate and our fear, Jesus will show us that the ruler of the universe is not sacrificial violence. The ruler of this universe is the God of love who loves like a mother hen, with a love that takes us under the wing. Jesus opens up to us a world where we can dare to trust and to give of ourselves and to renounce fear and sacrifice and replace it with mercy and love. Jesus wants to introduce a whole new way of life, a way of life where we can live without fear of enemies, for we have no enemies. He wants to nurture and care for us in a loving embrace where we know the warmth of God and trust it. Jesus was changing the expectations and calling for a loyalty to God's love over and above the powers that be, calling for peacemaking rather than starting wars, for turning the other cheek rather than surrendering or fighting. He was changing the expectations and calling for a loyalty to God. And in his letters, Paul is imitating Jesus in just this way, inviting his readers to join and imitate him as well. Paul writes, "Let each of you look not to your own interest, to the interest of others. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus. For though he was in the form of God, he did not consider that equality as something to be exploited, but he emptied himself, being born in human likeness, humbling himself to the point of death on a cross." Paul was teaching the very values that he learned from Jesus. Paul was creating inclusive communities that made everyone equal in spite of their economic status or their gender or their race, because he saw everyone equal in Christ. And because of that, he wrote these letters from prison. And 5 centuries later, Patrick would do the same. So on this St. Patrick's Day, we recognize someone who was willing to use tragic injustice in his life as a springboard to make a difference among the very people who had captured him. Rather than running from conflict or opposition, he moved towards it. Rather than buying into fear and saying, well, they are evil and they are hopeless, he grew to love the outsiders and gave his life to care for them. So we remember him on this day, one who followed and imitated Christ. And today we are reminded that we all have the choice to be the fox or the hen, to give in to the fear or to stretch our wings in love.